Good morning, everyone. I'm JD Friedland from Cleveland Clinic Ventures, and I'm really thrilled to moderate this panel on structural heart. With me are Bobo from Edwards, Jacques Essinger from Polaris Medical, Bill Phillips from Alruna Advisors, and Maggie Nixon from Capstan Medical. So we're really thrilled to have this conversation with you this morning. I'm going to just walk us through a few topics, and hopefully we can have a very spirited and productive discussion. So, as you just heard, now is a very exciting time in structural heart. We're witnessing the expansion and transition from solutions for aortic stenosis for additional transcatheter applications in both mitral and tricuspid valves across structural heart. So I'd love to hear from a couple of our panelists on what we expect the near future to bring. And just given all the news I've been reading lately about EVOQUE, why don't we start with Don?
Thanks, JD. And thanks for everybody for being here. Can you guys hear me okay in the back? Good? All right, perfect. We recently, many of you know, received approval of our EVOQUE tricuspid valve, both in the US and Europe, the first transcatheter tricuspid valve to hit the market. For those of you who think it's a linear path from conception to approval, it's not. It's quite a few twists and turns. It's a lot of learning about the patient, a lot of learning about the clinical pathway, your technology, how to get them delivered, how to image. All of that has to come together and fly in formation for these to be implanted successfully. And these things these aren't 2-year development programs. These are long-running programs where you're constantly learning and iterating on those learnings. But we're thrilled to be in a position to bring this forward to the marketplace, both in the US and Europe. A shout out to the regulatory agencies who saw the need. These patients today have no options. They're really not surgical candidates. There's no medicine that helps them. And so we had great partnership, both providing input on the trials, but also being active, willing partners to make sure these products came through a process that was rigorous, but also allowed them to get to patients. So good to be at this stage, but it's really only the beginning for those who think, well, great, you're there, it's done. Not really. There's a long way to go for this to be a standard of care therapy for patients.
Thanks, Don. I don't know, Jacques, is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, I can concur that there's nothing like a linear development in the structural heart. I'm currently heading a mitral program. We had our first in man in 2019 and thought it would be coming close to a slam dunk. And now in 2023, we're a second iteration and we're building it up. And the challenge is indeed, as we have been moving from the aortic to the other valves, is the endpoint are much harder to get, much softer, it takes much longer time to get. And also, especially in the mitral, we don't have a good animal model on which we can develop. So you have to go into the clinic with all the respect for the patients. Patients first is what we say, but at the same time, you know you're going to learn and you have to iterate. And this is where it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and for investors, a lot of money.
Thank you. I'm privileged to be part of Cleveland Clinic, and we're certainly seeing firsthand, with all of these innovations in structural heart, organizations like ourselves are seeing adverse impact on the ability to treat many of these patients because of the resource and staffing constraints that our hospital and many other hospitals are facing. And one of the corollaries to that is the longer the gap between diagnosis and treatment, the worse the outcomes are for patients. So it's great to have these new modalities, these new treatment methodologies, but we need to have the resources to support them, and we also need to move these patients quickly from diagnosis to treatment. So Bill, from your perspective, is this driven by where we are in terms of introduction of new devices? Is this the procedures themselves, or are there other factors that are involved from your perspective?
Yeah, I think from an investor perspective, I really empathize with the folks in the crowd today because the access to capital is tough. And you compound that in the structural heart space where the procedure times, though they're coming down from historical levels, the advent of COVID, and then particularly in the United States, you look at the challenges that the IDNs are facing from a funding perspective. they don't have the resources in place to be able to support these type of cases. So you're stuck in one end where you're at the mercy of having institutional challenges of being able to drive patient flow. And that goes all the way back to the diagnostic end. So when I look at it and look at the current situation, particularly as an investor supporting early stage companies, is how does an early stage company in this space pivot where you try to address, you maybe shrink your overall market scope and you try to go very deep in areas that you can provide value. So maybe you go to a Cleveland Clinic, maybe you go to an NYU, maybe you spend your more time, I'll be biased, Cedars-Sinai here in Los Angeles, versus historically you say, hey, I want to build a team of 5, 10, or 15 clinical teams to go in and support that. You really need to take a pivot back and help that institution understand how you're going to improve your process flow. Because today, with the way the CPT codes are set up and the struggles that they're facing at the administrative level, you've got to find a way to improve procedure time to improve the patient flow. If you don't do that, the institutions and the purchasing procurement teams are going to really struggle on saying, what value are you going to provide to me, and why should I include you into my usage continuum?
That's great. Don, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
A thought struck me as you asked the question and as Bill answered it. You kind of have two ends that create pressure. Today, in probably one of the most successful therapies, transcatheter aortic valves, in 2024, we as an industry will treat 13 of the 100 that have ACC AHA guideline disease. Now, 10 years ago, we treated 6, so we've made progress. You combine that with, and there's a lot of chaos with how patients get detected, diagnosed, lost, handed off, or not. Then you combine that with the pressure the systems have, you mentioned, where is there really capacity to bring the kind of treatment to aortic, then mitral, then tricuspid? And I think there's both ends of this that's going to require many of us to bring innovation to really give patients what they really want, and that is timely therapy.
Yeah, no, that's great.
I'd love to chime in.
Yeah, please,
on
go ahead.
One thing that I really like saying, I started my career in the surgical side of cardiac. I started at Intuitive on the original cardiac team, which we pivoted, shot for the heart, hit the prostate. And so I started working with cardiac surgeons, but one of the really neat things shifting over into the cardiology space now is seeing the concept of heart teams really building out in a powerful way in the hospitals, and seeing the triage of patients come in with the imager, the cardiac surgeon, the cardiologist, all sitting right next to each other to push them through and find the ideal solution space is awesome, because I do think it's going to change the timelines by which patients move through. Now, I think from industry, our job is to give them a good, robust set of tools to optimize that patient treatment all the way through.
No, that's great.
Yeah, I think what you bring up on that one as well, because that 13 to 100, if you go back in EP, and EP really struggled for a long period of time. It had to be the set of tools. It had to be the institution mindset. It had to be the certification of the right set of electrophysiologists to take that 13 to now 30. And I think that there needs to be a structural mindset, because the hard part is we can do these things in large institutions, but when you're trying to spread them across, where you really need to drive patient access, that's where I think innovation needs to really rethink and drive that in. But it's also that focused element in terms of how you're going to support that patient workflow into that institution.
Absolutely. And so, Maggie, I haven't been ignoring you. This next question is definitely right up your alley. So one of the other areas of innovation we're seeing in structural heart is the introduction of complementary tools and technologies to support exactly some of the challenges that we just talked about. So that can be everything from enhancing visualization, increasing placement accuracy, as well as incorporating robotic-assisted surgical solutions, which will all be critical to advancing the level of comfort and the adoption rate of some of these solutions. So let me ask both Jacques and Maggie to maybe comment a little bit on what you think the pace and the impact of the incorporation of such technologies will be, and then how important it is going to be for the incorporation of these technologies for the eventual adoption of these procedures across a broader set of clinicians.
You have you just have such a history in the structural heart space. I'm still new there. So at Capstan Medical, I'm on my second company. My first company I was at Intuitive Surgical from 2000 to 2022. So 22 years with Intuitive, and it was amazing to me that robotics had not really entered the structural heart space in a powerful way. And at Capstan Medical, we're trying to bring novel implant technology that is enabled through robotic delivery and deployment. And so this is a place where development teams working shoulder to shoulder can bring these novel concepts to market. If you've got a highly capable delivery system, you can do different things with your implant. You can do different geometries that accommodate more patient anatomies and whatnot if you've got the precision and control of robotics behind it. But with that being said, these development timelines are extensive, going all the way through the implant, clinical burden, all the way through a complex piece of software-controlled hardware, right? And so it's not for the faint of heart. Yes. Bringing together structural heart and robotics is not for the faint of heart. But I think it's the right solution to really be bringing, options to these patients that are underserved right now.
So that's the second pun you've used. I think I'm going to call you out on that one. So go ahead, Jacques.
I would add that there is also has been a very big change and improvement on all the imaging modality, especially even for your robot. Without imaging, your robot does nothing. And if you think that TAVR was done basically just on the basis of angio, now we take mitral and tricuspid, it is all echo-based, 3D echo. And I can see in the future other technologies, other imaging modalities that are just going to be making the procedure much more easier, much more visible for physicians. I'm still surprised when we get a echo for a mitral. There's still a little bit of a debate. What are we seeing here? Is it this or is it that? So in order to further improve, we will need also significant, and they're coming, improvement on the imaging side.
Just your thoughts on the timing. Obviously, we've seen relatively long timelines because of the regulatory process for the introduction of these transcatheter solutions for structural heart. Do you anticipate a similar timeline for some of the complementary tools, or do you feel like there's going to be a more rapid regulatory and adoption pathway for those solutions?
I think for the imaging tools, it's a question of having them available, developed, being used. I don't see a regulatory hurdle for that. It might be a logistic hurdle within a hospital. I mean, just think if we could be doing a TAVR or a mitral inside an MRI, having 4D access online, it would be a big change.
Yeah.
Are we going to be able to get that tomorrow? No. In the future? Maybe.
Great. So, Don, I want to come back to a topic you raised before, which I think is really critically important. We've been talking about it, I think, for much of this panel. There's some amazing innovations that are coming out and really addressing the need in this space. But as we've all experienced to some degree, there's a gauntlet of regulatory, commercial, adoption, and clinical hurdles. How can companies align themselves with the appropriate regulatory agencies, with hospitals like Cleveland Clinic, with the payer community, to address some of these expected reimbursement pathways and adoption pathways to create less friction from great innovation to standardization and adoption of these technologies? And so, Bill, why don't I have you start first, and then Maggie, I'd love to have you comment as well.
I was hoping somebody else was going to answer this one first, and I could follow. Ladies first. Ladies first. Did I say ladies first? So it is a real issue. I will give a compliment because I think it's due. I think that the FDA is really trying. If we look historically along my career, the U.S. was always, the FDA was last. You would do EU first, and then maybe Asian markets, and then the U.S. would always follow. Today, I think that the FDA has really understood that the changes in overall regulatory guidelines, that they are at the central point to be able to figure out how they're going to support innovation. Now, as an investor, and obviously the folks who are on the innovation side, there's probably always continued frustration, whether it's the regulatory pathway or the definitions, particularly as it relates to remote management care or digital therapies. Because as every patient wants to do today, they want to be involved from a digital perspective, and they want to be, whether other comorbidities that come into it, but the FDA is just behind. I think what happens now is that going into these groups, and particularly from an early stage firm, is the depth that you have to think about where you're going to go in your regulatory journey, and then the second part of it is what is your reimbursement? I think sometimes we don't spend enough time on beyond the first question of why that CPT code is that CPT code. I think you need to really spend a lot of time thinking through what are the avenues that you can navigate, and then when you go in and prepare for your pre-sub or your other meetings, you're actively going in and leading a discussion versus you're trying to go in with some discussion points and try to lead with questions. So in this regards today, and I'm going to stay with the FDA because other countries are now kind of somewhat following, the FDA is really trying to figure out, particularly for early stage companies, through TAP and through other initiatives, how to support innovation in the United States to be able to export that. Our job now, from an investor and to support you and you as an innovator, as a company, is how to really focus in and streamline on where you want to go and how you want to go. But you have to be able to be flexible to pivot. I'm really early in my own investment cycle here, but in some of the companies that I've worked with and I've said no to, is that they're coming back and saying, no, I'm really stuck on this is the avenue that I need to go because the FDA has said as a predicate A, B, C, D, and E.
Right.
And that doesn't necessarily mean today within these new innovations coming through, Edwards can spend $100 million and an Abbott can spend $100 million on big name platforms. But as a startup, you really need to go in and be very specific, but you need to be aggressive and think about how do you partner and navigate and pivot. That's how I kind of think about it now, because I think it's a different environment that we're living than even what we were 12 months ago.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And I'll echo the comments on, I think all of us have seen that breakthrough designation did not quite have the impact to timelines and so on that we had anticipated. But at least it's been acknowledged, and that's why there's, kind of the pilot of the TAP program was pretty successful last year, and they're obviously focusing on, the cardiovascular space, the neurovascular space, which has fewer options in that market right now. And so I think the key thing that you're saying is being proactive, engaging really early on both kind of what is the regulatory pathway and the reimbursement pathway is important. I think on the flip side, from the innovation side, what the bar is going to be from a clinical target space. One thing I'm focusing on is making sure our inclusion is going to be strong enough so that you can get recruitment of the patients. It is my job to deliver a solution that has sufficient inclusion to really drive those numbers to get that clinical data. So that happens in partnership, right? That's like being really thoughtful on the disease state, the needs of the market, and understanding, and providing something that's close to it, and then working with those regulators to put a robust plan together.
So I'm going to throw you guys a little bit of a curveball because Bill brought it up. But could you comment a little bit on the foreign regulatory bodies and how the company's strategy ought to take into account some of the other large markets outside the U.S.?
Yeah, so today in some of the firms that I'm partnering with is that I've really asked for them, because you can look at you can look at the pie of the globe and say, wow, I'd love to be in all those markets. But today, to be honest, MDR is tough. If I was an innovator looking at certain markets to go to, MDR would be the last place I would put $1. I would let the strategics go with that, let them spend that time and money to build those markets. But as an early stage player, I would think about these following markets. Number one, Japan. Japan is now pivoting again through MHLW, through some of the regulatory pieces, because they want to catch back up on innovation because they have a highly aged population. But the reimbursement, if you're at the right reimbursement code and you bring the right set of clinical data, you can establish a dedicated code that will completely differentiate you for 5 to 7 years, that will drive your gross margin values, that will help position the valuation of your company. Secondly, I would look at Australia. The TGA has historically, even back in 2017 and 2018, have always been progressive to want to be able to be involved in early stage clinical work. If you look at at the team down in Australia. Steve, his name has now slipped my mind, on structural heart, did a lot of the TAVI work, a lot of the mitral work. But Australia and the TGA have always been aggressive because they want to be part of the forefront of clinical work. And then you now look at, I've seen some recent pivots probably in the last 6 months or so. If you look at Chile, if you look at some other markets from a clinical perspective, those markets as well are wanting to be involved, but it's an issue of affordability. So if I today were to spend my dollars, I would go at Japan, I would go heavily at Australia as an early stage, and then I would figure out if I have my dollars in place, can I build enough patent protection in China to be able to assess where, what, and how I'm going to play into that market.
Great.
Well, being probably the only European on the panel, I have to step up here. Well, let me first say I agree with you. The MDR is a real nightmare, and I think that we have seen it over and over in Europe. They have that ability, unique ability from swinging from one extreme to another extreme. And we can go back what has been driving the change from to the MDR. So a number of really unspeakable drama in the medical device. But I'm not as pessimistic as you are, because I think that there's a lot of talk that the MDR is going too far. They would like to basically have almost an FDA-like, but without having the centralized of the FDA. So it is going to swing back. So I would say I keep looking at running some of our studies in Europe. I still look at getting ACE mark, but contrary to the past, I'm running full steam in the US. So that's a little bit the change.
Great. So my last formal question, and I'll maybe start, but I'd love to hear all the panelists comment on this. What does the future hold for us in structural heart? One of the things, when I have observed other disease modalities where we've had minimally invasive and other interventional solutions, we start to see procedures move from multi-day procedures to single-day procedures to same-day procedures. So is there a future where a structural heart solution can be delivered by either outpatient or by an ASC type model? One of the challenges, as I mentioned earlier, that Cleveland Clinic and pretty much every hospital system in the world is dealing with is the supply-demand imbalance of labor and other critical resources. And if we're able to leverage other capabilities and accelerate our turnaround times, we can serve more patients. Again, we can address that gap between diagnosis and treatment and get patients treated faster. But would love to get each of the panelists' perception on what is the 5, 10, 15 years from now? What is the care model and what does the business model look like for structural heart? So why don't we start with Maggie and we'll work our way down.
There's a lot of questions in there.
Sorry.
So I think I'll start from the technology side. I think we're going to have an intersect between the capabilities in the surgical space and the capabilities in the cardiology space. I think a set of tools will come in to let you do some things that you typically would only have done surgically, trying to have the valve leaflet modifications, but do it with cardiology catheter-based tools and so on. So I think you're going to have a set of technology that brings pieces of surgery and cardiology together. And so that will give you options, like different ways to treat all the variable anatomy. And when you're in the mitral and the tricuspid space, you're operating in 3D space. You're not operating in a tube.
Right.
And so that kind of technology is really needed. And so I think that's a key part. And then to your point, I think we need to, like surgery, where you go in and you treat a mitral and a tricuspid on the same day at the same time, I think we need to get to a technology model and a reimbursement model that lets you do that so that the patient can be completely served on a single intervention. And I think that's in the best interest of the patient, right? And I think there's limitations that need to be addressed, especially on the reimbursement side.
Yeah, that's a great point. Don?
Great, good. Maggie, I'll go a little bit a different direction. I think in the last 10, 15 years, we've seen the emergence of implants that can be delivered by catheters to fix valves, to repair valves, to quite frankly intervene in non-valvular structural heart, think of heart failure. So if I take your question and say, okay, in 10 years, what is it going to look like? I think we'll have a series of interventions that can largely address mitral, tricuspid, aortic, pulmonic disease with catheter-based techniques. I think there will be enough different kinds of interventions so you'll be able to cover the majority of etiologies of the disease. And I think today that's not true. I think in 10 years that becomes true. Importantly, though, I think we're going to see a lot of other innovation come alongside these implants. You mentioned imaging. Imaging, there's a lot of sophistication you can bring to imaging where you're able to conflate different imaging modalities, have it on the screen, have it guide your intervention, know where you're at, know where you're going, know what the issues are. That's something that I think if it was in the future, it's going to significantly simplify and speed up these procedures. I think there's going to be accessories that allow operators, I'll say average operators, the people that aren't always at academic centers doing 200 a year, to have similarly great outcomes, which is going to open up the access for a lot of patients that today don't have the access to the Cleveland clinics, the Mayo clinics, the Cedars-Sinai, to get the kind of breadth of intervention that the academic center has. So 10 years, I think we're going to see a lot more opportunity for innovation to speed diagnosis, detection, treatment, and to make it much more widely available.
Yeah, I love that idea of democratizing and improving access to these solutions because the markets are huge. If there's only 5 to 10 centers of excellence that can service them, we're never going to address the market substantially. Jacques?
Yeah, so you were asking, can we do structural heart in an outpatient? I think from a procedure standpoint, it can be done. The one big question is the aftercare. We should not forget the importance of the aftercare. From an experience going into some countries, as you have said, Chile or Paraguay, we can do the procedure, but this is where the aftercare is hurting. So I think that if there's a possibility to be providing in an outpatient form, the kind of aftercare monitoring that would allow the patient to go home, but still being some kind of monitored so patient could be interacted very quickly, this could be it. But the aftercare should not be forgotten.
I have a follow-up question on that, but let's come back.
Yeah, so I every time you add the word AI to something, people cringe, and I don't want to cringe on this one, but I think that there is a very relevant point as relates to imaging. I think that the machine learning data sets and the speed of which certain AI modules are being developed at institutions across the globe are going to leap. And what we imagine today in terms of the imaging modeling that we have versus what potentially could be, I think is going to really fundamentally change the access of structural heart. Mm-hmm. And so I am excited about those elements of AI, and I'm also interested in terms of how those support some elements of development. But I also look at the hospital system. This process workflow, I think that there's going to be opportunities, particularly within leading institutions. They're going to be able to provide workflow models that are going to improve processes and drive work through. And then I think in the United States, this is where the ASCs become very interesting.
Yeah.
Because now the aftercare aspect, if you're a Banner Healthcare and you're already running your own owned ASC or the Cleveland Clinic, you have the access to the patient flow. You can run them through the ASC, and then you can have an adjunct institution that if something, unfortunately, if it does go wrong, you have maybe some sort of access to be able to kind of manage that activity. But I do believe that there is going to be a rapid movement over the next probably 48 to 60 months where you're going to see the FDA saying, where else can we bring in these codes into outpatient settings that are going to provide value and set the foundation of skill development and learning? Because it goes back to the skill of who's in that room. Mm-hmm. If you don't have that skill level in the room, it doesn't matter what you say, you're not going to be able to do the case. So it's going to take time for them to build that skill level in the room. But when that skill level and capacity gets there, I think you'll start seeing reimbursement pricing strategies pivot to start encouraging that type of move.
Yeah, so I want to come back to, that's great, thank you, Bill. I want to come back to a thought that, Jacques, your response gave to me. And as a healthcare institution, Cleveland Clinic, we identify even today patients who are coming in for a procedure, they're getting discharged, we hand them discharge instructions that read like TV antenna installation instructions, the compliance post-surgical follow-up is, I mean, here we've done this, like, put this innovative solution into the patient that will change the way their life proceeds. Many of them absolutely follow their post-surgical follow-up, but a lot of them don't. And so what kind of solutions, are going to be critical, particularly if, in fact, these procedures are going to move to, I'll call it a lighter touch, an ASC or an outpatient environment, that post-surgical follow-up and making sure that the patient remains, there's a level of engagement that remains between the patient and the clinical community. Are there solutions you guys are seeing out there that you're imagining that are going to allow that stickiness to remain so that the patient, stays healthy and is getting the follow-up that they need? Anyone want to go first?
Okay. Well, I think I would make a difference between the short-term aftercare, so the 48, 72 hours, and the longer term.
Yeah.
So in the 48, 72 hours, I think that there will be and should be technologies that are able to effectively monitor better the patients when we send them home. If you send them home after an outpatient, that will be one set. For the longer run, I think it will come to digital health and different tools to be able to remind patients. And I can name a case of patients where we have to call the patients almost every month to remind her that she has to take her anticoagulation drugs. That should be done differently.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's an interesting, when you point out how do some of these new things fit into the healthcare ecosystem, right? I mean, I think one of the few benefits of COVID was how pervasive telemedicine has become. It's become like touch points that have become more acceptable, right, in the COVID world, but also new technologies that are helping monitor, kind of patient stats in a different way, test kits that are sent home, right, those sorts of things. So I think there's an ecosystem that you're seeing through all the tendrils of what we're saying. This is imaging companies working with device manufacturers to integrate, imaging, register devices, and bring these things together and work in a cohesive fashion. I think all of the pieces need to be done in that holistic view.
Yeah, I think that pharma is already leading that way, right? And so you get the Digital Therapeutic Alliance that's aggressively trying to engage with the FDA on reimbursement. But I think that pharma is really leading the area as it relates to that end for CBT, right? There is an avenue for us to be able to try to learn from that quickly and apply that into the medical device side. But I'm going to make one small caveat on this one as well, because I think sometimes we get so passionate about the industry or the products that we sell into the institution. Sometimes we don't think of the after effect or the impact that it's having on the workflow. Mm-hmm. And we think, well, we brought in the best technology, we brought the best widget, but that patient treatment continuum or how that's going to fit into the other devices that are going to be part of that procedure. Sometimes we need to take a step back somewhat and think about where does that fit within the value chain, and so what as it relates to procurement and administration and that value component.
Yeah. Bill, maybe to that point, I think broadening our lens on innovation and not just be the implant, but to think about how do you innovate the aftercare and that whole process. And look, I agree with the comments. There's going to be a lot of digital tools that are going to make that easier. The other thing I'll put on the table, and we've seen this, I don't know if in 10 years you won't have a lot of devices that are implants that are a lot smarter than today, mm-hmm. with integrated sensors and the ability to communicate both with the patients and to, at the right time, connect with the caregiver when things change.
No, that's great. So we have a few extra minutes. Maybe, I don't know if our panelists have final thoughts for emerging companies in the structural heart space that we want to share. I know, Bill, you had some good thoughts on like geographies to go after, but there's obviously a challenging market. This is a market with long lead times in terms of development, and it's not cheap. But given the current environment that we're facing and the likely environment we're facing in the future, any last words of advice?
Yeah, my only perspective is really around the commitment to deliver to the time goals that you've set. People sometimes build out I always encourage the companies I invest in, I need to see a 6-quarter timeline in terms of what they're going to do, why they're going to do it, and what does that actually mean for the end goal. And that's not easy to do because most of the time you're thinking about how do I get through next week. And so it forces, coming from a big strategic side, it forces one to think about what must I do that's going to push this value to be able to deliver the result to support patient care. That's one. The second one is I've really kind of taken a big pause maybe over the last 4 months. I really thought that the capital markets would have freed up. At least that's what Paul Violet, told me last year. He says, Bill, don't worry, jump into this, and the markets will be open, and you'll be off to the races. And it's not really worked out that way so far.
Well, he might have said 2024. We still have many months to go before 2024 ends.
But I really would have hoped by this time that there would have been a free up of capital that would have been coming into the earlier stage medical device side. And I think that kind of coming back to this meeting, there is still a challenge in that end. What I say to that is if you're raising your early rounds, if you're getting your money and you got that money, take a quick breath, but think about what is your next round? What does that need to look like? And what are those deliverables that you need to get that you're showing value to those future investors that you can actually do what needs to get done? Because that, I think, is going to change where that check is going to go to which company that is going to advance the innovation that they believe is going to be able to deliver it forward.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important point, and maybe the advice I would bolt onto that is, what Bill's talking about is value inflection points.
Correct.
Show me, as an investor, how you're going to use this round of capital to demonstrate a discrete advancement that's going to de-risk the opportunity, and then also show me that you do it within the time frame and within the budget that you expect. And obviously, things happen that no one can predict, but show me what you're going to do, and then go do it, and then show me that you did it, and then that creates an environment for me as an investor to get a lot more excited about investing in the company. Jacques, you look like you want to say something.
Oh, I didn't mean to, but I can. Now, I think one of the big challenges, especially for startup, is when you're running clinical studies, is to be able to access to the right patients, especially if you're running either EFS in the US or trying to do early feasibility study in Europe, where I speak to myself in the mitral space, you have the mitral clip, you have the Pascal there. So naturally, for physicians, they are just going to give you the worst of the worst patients, the patients that nobody would want to treat. And this is probably the worst place where you want to take and start an innovative. So you're forced to go into other jurisdictions where such devices are not available. And then you are confronted with the issue of patients, environment, aftercare. And this is, I think, what has changed between what I'm doing today and what I did 15 years ago when I started CMETIS in the TAVR. I would no longer be able today in Europe to access the patients that I had access 15 years ago. I think this is a big, big difference for a startup. Access to patients for early feasibility studies.
Yeah, really good point. So I want to. We're just about out of time here. I want to thank my panelists. I threw them a couple of unscripted questions, and they performed admirably. So thank you all for your time, and I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us here today.
Thank you.